Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Money and Banking. We're going to be continuing with Chapter 7, which was dealing with the efficient market hypothesis. The initial part of this was to give you the core orthodox theory, which stated that individuals behaved rationally. It provided you with a mechanism by which rational people would behave, that which is known as the optimal forecast, and then it discussed the implications for the overarching market, assuming that individuals were trading rationally, namely that market prices always reflected all available information, and any prediction of stock prices was impossible because disturbances reflected new information which were unpredictable and therefore random, right? So markets are efficient. They're efficient at absorbing information. The prices that are reflected there reflect some process of efficiency. Markets left to their own devices are inherently good. They're inherently efficient. They're inherently optimal. I'd like to present you with a secondary school of thought that's become much more sort of popular over the years, particularly after the Great Recession, even though the foundations, the assumptions that are in play in this sort of alternative model do not jive well with most of the mathematics in, say, your finance book. All of that requires efficient market hypothesis to be operating. But this is at least the germane seed of an alternative way at looking at not only human behavior, but also at the efficiency of financial markets. This is called the behavioral approaches or behavioral finance. Let's talk a little bit about it. It's just going to be a brief introduction. So what is this behavioral finance thing? Well, it's rooted in actually the psychology department, and it's rooted in studies in behavioral psychology, particularly the behavior of humans. So we look at not how the world would be if all people were rational, but we look at human behavior itself and ask ourselves the question, do people behave in a rational way, even if they understand reason and mathematics and so on and so forth, or do they not, right? So within behavioral finance, humans are assumed not to act rationally, right? Rather, they act in a predictable, irrational way. So it's not that they react in a chaotic way. They are behaving irrationally, but they're behaving irrationally in repetitive ways, in predictive ways, in ways that can be codified, in ways that can be understood, if you will. And this is the roots of behavioral psychology. Now, when we look at these ways in which people behave persistently irrationally, we can start incorporating that into at least every section of human behavior. And since we're in economics and finance, we can apply it to behavioral economics and behavioral finance. Now, some of the pioneers of this work are Daniel Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize in 2002, and he has several books out there. One of the ones that is kind of fodder for laymen at Barnes and Noble and so on and so forth. It's called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And if you talk to a lot of sort of educated people and you bring up Kahneman's work, they'll immediately revert to Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. It should be on any college student's reading list. We also have Robert Shiller, who's a professor at Yale, and he's one of the first people to sort of work with the results of Daniel Kahneman, the behavioral finance school, in order to specifically attack the efficient market hypothesis. One of his seminal papers, From Efficient Markets to Behavioral Finance, provides some of the statistical logic wherein he rejects the notions of efficient markets and petitions for the idea that scholars need to take a behavioral approach if they want to truly understand markets. Robert Shiller, again at Yale, what was some of his main arguments? Well, he said there's a lack of short selling in the market. There should be far more than we actually see. If people were rational, we should see more short selling than there actually is. And so this is causing overpriced stocks. Now, why might there be a lack of short selling? He explained this by the prevalence of something called loss aversion. And you'll hear about loss aversion in many, many different contexts. It's in context, obviously, of social psychology and individual psychology. It's in topics of negotiation and so on and so forth. The general idea behind loss aversion is that equivalent gains and losses are not valued equally, right? I mean, we might think that if I gave you $1, your utility would increase by $1. And if I took $1 away from you, your utility would decrease by a dollar also, that, these weights would be equivalent whether you were gaining a dollar or losing a dollar, since that dollar represents the same amount of goods and services, either gained or lost, and goods and services represent utility. But the idea of loss aversion is that you might be X amount happy when you get a dollar, and you might be 2X unhappy when you lose a dollar. So the idea here is that losses and gains are not weighted evenly, specifically that losses are weighted more heavily than equivalent gains. Another point that Shiller makes is that there are large trading volumes and that these might be explained by investor overconfidence rather than new news or any rational reason or any reasonable change to an optimal forecast. These large trading volumes don't reflect new news and optimal forecasts. They have to reflect something else. And Shiller thinks this might be reflected by another sort of bias on the part of individuals, which would be overconfidence, right? You're not basing your trades on any kind of fundamental rational model. You're buying, the stock goes up, you become confident in your abilities, you think you're a star trader, you think you know something the market doesn't know, you think you're wiser, you think you're the smartest person in the room, and then you double down and triple down. And if many people are doing this, then you might see very large trading volumes that appear to be out of whack with any kind of news justification of such volumes. So, Robert Shiller is saying we've got these stock market bubbles and we need to explain them. He thinks that efficient market hypothesis does not explain them well. Overpriced stocks and large volumes creating these bubbles. He says these might be explained by overconfidence and another phenomenon, which is social contagion. You all know about social contagion from the phenomenon of virality. You see it very frequently in your interaction with the internet and social media, where small, almost innocuous videos from some far-off place of someone on a slip and slide in their backyard or some other content literally sweeps the entire globe in a matter of days, right? So someone has an idea, that idea catches on, and regardless of the validity of that idea or the vetting process of that idea, or the applicability of that idea, there becomes some kind of contagion or virality. And so Shiller is saying that human beings are prone to this social contagion, whereas individuals might become extremely optimistic or extremely pessimistic about market conditions merely because of the hum and the buzz of that happening within their social sort of network, if you will. And that this either exceptional optimism or pessimism might not be motivated by anything rational or fundamental, might simply be motivated by social contagion, social consensus, if you will. So some of the questions you might be asking yourself are, is everyone that participates in financial markets a rational, optimal forecaster, or are they human beings prone to the kind of dislogics that all human beings are prone to? Things such as loss aversion, things such as overconfidence or hubris, things such as social contagion. If you feel that the behavioral approach to studying human behavior and the manifestation and aggregation of that human behavior in formation of stock prices through buying and selling plays a heavy role, then you might have different conclusions about what stock prices reflect. Rather than reflecting things like optimal forecasts, maybe they reflect these human irrationalities. And if it is the case that financial market prices reflect human irrationalities, then they're not arguably efficient, right? And perhaps some sort of intervention by the way of regulation might stabilize them or make them more efficient. This is an age-old debate between whether or not Adam Smith's invisible hand, markets left to their own devices, individuals left to make their own choices, leads to socially optimal outcomes, or whether or not they do not lead to socially optimal outcomes, and the intervention of some other force, typically the government, is enticed to enter in order to try to achieve a higher level of efficiency. So it's a big sort of fulcrum of disagreement in the discipline, not only in finance and in money and banking, but in macroeconomics and microeconomics and public policy as well. So the real root of Schiller's work and Daniel Kahneman's work, right, although Schiller applies it to financial markets in particular, comes from a more general category of study in psychology, and that is, of course, cognitive bias. There are reams and reams of cognitive biases. Cognitive biases, generally as a category, are these predictably patterned ways that humans make decisions that are not rational, that are in contrast to the way a rational individual would make those choices, in contrast to the way a computer would make those choices. We have these certain biases, these cognitive issues that sort of blind us from being able to make rational choices or steer us away from making rational choices. And many of these are rooted in, sort of biology, evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology. They may have been ways that we, made decisions with limited information, or made decisions with limited amount of time, or made decisions, with limited amount of cognitive capacity, just for the ease of making fast decisions, or having group solidarity, or something that might have been very conducive to being part of a tribe, or passing genes on, and so on and so forth. So what are some of these cognitive biases? And if you get into cognitive biases, which I highly recommend that you do if you want to feel very educated in, humans and human behavior and marketing and politics and manipulation and thinking, and thinking in a way that's valid versus thinking in a way that is invalid, right? Pitfalls of your own thinking and on my thinking and every Homo sapiens thinking, then you'll definitely get into cognitive bias. But let's talk about a few of them that might, sort of play out well in economics and finance. One of them is called the representative heuristic. And the idea here is that individuals, when they're forming some idea about, the way that a variable moves, or the probabilities that we would attach to something happening or not happening, that individuals disregard base rate probabilities in favor of observed similarities or patterns. So, for instance, in the housing market boom that led up to the crisis of 2007, individuals maybe didn't look at 20 or 30 years of housing price data to say, okay, we are in the middle of an extreme bubble right now, right? The prices that we're seeing go up and up and up every year for the last 7 years, that's completely out of whack with 30 years of data. And so if we looked at averages and probabilities on average over a long span of time, we would say, wow, we're way out of whack with what's normal, and things are going to come down. But individuals would disregard those base rate probabilities in favor of observed similarities and patterns. So rather than look at 30 years of data and the probabilities and average home prices therein, they would just look at the last 7 years, and they'd say, well, if I bought in 97 and I sold in 2001, I would have doubled my money, and in 2003 I would have tripled my money, in 2004 I would have quadrupled my money. Oh my God, house prices keep going up and up and up and up. So we're looking at a short series of a representative heuristic, similarities and patterns that do not represent overarching probabilities and overarching patterns in the available. So if you're looking at housing pricing data and you're just looking at it for the 10 years up to the crisis, you think, well, it's a no-brainer to buy a home because the housing prices will just go up. If I ever have a problem with the loan or anything else, I'll just sell the home for more than I bought it from, and I won't suffer anything. But the likelihood that I'll make, some kind of huge equity gain is very high. So this is the representative heuristic, selectively looking at patterns of behavior in data or something else that you then use to characterize the thing, disregarding a broader, more applicable set of data, sort of like just looking at 10 years of home prices to try to understand the direction of home price variables in the future, rather than looking at a larger representative set of the data. Representative heuristics, these simple way of forming ideas about something based off of some collection of similarities or some short collection of patterns that doesn't accurately represent what you're trying to predict or judge. Another one is saliency bias, and I very much am fond of saliency bias simply because I see it used a lot. I see it used in negotiation, I see it used in marketing, I see it used in politics, I see it used all the time. And I think so it's very effective, and I think it's very effective at sort of manipulating the way people view reality or view the world around them. It's a very powerful tool, and it can be a very powerful tool that's often used against you. So you have to be quite aware of it. So saliency bias is the idea that we have anomalies of attention and human error, right? We tend to pay attention to that which is salient, that which is right in front of our face, that which is put in front of our face over and over and over and over and over and over again. And whatever happens to be most close to our visual field or our mental field, or that which happens to be repeated the most time in our visual field, we tend to overweight that in terms of making judgments about the larger world or, say, the larger data series. So maybe a good example would be something like, I don't know, Bitcoin or something, right? People talk about Bitcoin, they talk about Bitcoin, they talk about Bitcoin, they talk about Bitcoin. It keeps showing up. And then pretty soon you go to get a coffee and your barista, who has absolutely no experience in finance whatsoever, is recommending that you buy Bitcoin. And somehow this thing becomes increasingly salient. You think about it more than you would think about other sort of investment options. You're paying more attention to it, right? And then you dive in. And as more and more people do this, right, you start to see markets represent the saliency bias of individuals. There are numerous examples of this. There's just one sort of given to you off the cuff. Now, another cognitive bias I don't think anybody needs any explanation of is confidence, overconfidence, and self-esteem or hubris. Now, culturally, now we're used to thinking of an inordinate amount of confidence, an infinite amount of confidence, an infinite amount of self-esteem as being a good thing that should be cultivated and protected at all costs, right? And if there's any loss of confidence, there must be some problem with the world around you, or any loss of self-esteem, there must be some problem with the world around you, but certainly nothing should daunt your confidence or your self-esteem. So this brings us to these concepts of hubris, right? One of these great sort of Greek words, which was, always the harbinger of disaster for an individual. They'd get overconfident. They'd get too much hubris. They'd think they were infallible. And then, of course, things would collapse around them because those are delusions, right? So the idea here is that when you hold probabilities constant, people tend to bet in situations where they perceive their confidence is higher. So an example might be something like, you have to get from point A to point B. One of the paths to get to point B is to cross a river. The other path to get to point B is to cross a mountain. Now, many people have done this, and what they've calculated is that there's a 50% chance of making it to point B by taking the river route, and a 50% chance of making it to route B by taking the mountain route. But you know that you're a swimmer. And so you go, I'm definitely taking the river route. Now, the fact that you're a swimmer doesn't change the probabilities of getting from point A to point B over either route, because those probabilities were gathered from very, very large sample sizes. But because you have an association with route B in terms of your perceived competence, right, you end up taking that path. Now, if these probabilities, 50-50%, were well sampled over large groups of people, then the fact that you're a swimmer or not a swimmer won't impact those probabilities at all, right? It will just impact them in your own mind, right? But you'll still have a 50-50 chance of getting to point B. You might be able to take the same analogy to a casino, right? I mean, the odds in casinos are known, they are fixed, and the house always has odds that are stacked against the player, right? If you walk in there and you're thinking about playing blackjack or playing the slot machines, the fact that you've played blackjack before or hit slot machines before doesn't change the probabilities of those games. Those games are rooted regardless of your personal perceived confidence in each of them, right? But an individual's delusion that they have a higher chance of winning in a game that they maybe have played before causes them to have a bit of overconfidence and too much self-esteem and think that their odds are better, when in fact, the fact that they've played that game sometime in the past doesn't change the odds of blackjack. Wishful thinking, another human pitfall that everyone lays prey to. And that's the thing with these cognitive biases. If you're a Homo sapien, you're vulnerable of these. You're risky with these. You've done these, right? You've committed these logical fallacies before. And everyone is vulnerable to wishful thinking. Julius Caesar, famous quote, "Men willingly believe what they wish." This is one of the things that really traps a lot of people in scams, makes people a lot of times a victim to fraud or victim to con artists, if you will. Oftentimes con artists will play on older people that maybe have been conservative throughout their lives, and they've taken very, very safe financial bets, and they've seen maybe some very salient individuals around in the press or in their social media feed who were very, very wealthy or took a chance and knocked it out of the park, and they put some money into Bitcoin or Google or something, and they were stratospherically wealthy later, even though they obviously had no forward knowledge as to what the future would hold regarding any of those stocks, if you will, right? And they think, well, maybe I've missed the boat, and I deserve to have been wealthy, and now is my time, and so on and so on and so forth. And so oftentimes these scam artists, whether they're Ponzi schemes or what have you, will promise absurdly high returns. Something like consistent 25% quarterly returns, right? Now you could think the economy is growing at what, 2%, and you annually, and you have some sort of asset that's growing at 25% consistently quarterly. The rate of growth of your asset should swallow the entire economy if it's able to persist at that level of return over a long period of time. Now, if you make that one quarter and lose it the next three, that's not true. But if you're consistently making 25% returns, the value of your investment is growing so large relative to the size of GDP that eventually, if you're able to do that consistently, you would swallow all of GDP, if you will. So people, if they were looking at long-range, investments and generalized rate of returns over multiple assets, would say, consistent 25% returns is absolutely absurd. It's a total anomaly. It would just never happen. It's not conceivable to happen. It's delusional to think that this investment would be a good idea or even a reasonable idea, and yet wishful thinking will take over. They'll think that they could win the jackpot, and they will give their money to the con artist. So wishful thinking, huge thing. Another idea behind wishful thinking is that some stock market prices will always go up, which never happens, right? Throughout history, there's always ups and downs. Now, you do well over the long haul in a growing, strong, thriving economy like the U.S. economy, but you will have your ups and downs, and to think that something always goes up or that some industry will always be competitive or always be around is delusional thinking. But you might wish that it's true and therefore believe that it's true and then sink your money into the foolish idea. Right? So another cognitive bias, this one very much associated with, being conned, if you will, being a victim of some kind of financial scheme or financial con, if you will. Individuals have the tendency to overestimate probability of success for entities that they feel associated with. Now, this tendency is associated with other cognitive biases, that are more formally termed things like confirmation bias, and the idea here is that, sort of regardless of whether or not, an idea is right or wrong, the fact that you're associated with it, maybe the fact that you've espoused a belief in it in the past, or it somehow is a part of what you view as your identity, right? You view it as being a more correct idea than you would if you were viewing it dispassionately without the lens of, what supports my identity or supports my self-esteem and what goes against it. So, for instance, an individual might take a political belief. You could pick anyone that you want, right? They may pick a political belief that, say, tax cuts generate rising wages for the poor. So you give tax cuts to the wealthy, and it generates, rising incomes for the poor. They maybe have stated this. They've stated this to their family, their friends. They've put it on their Twitter account. They've written articles about it. Maybe they have been a pundit about this for forever. And then reams and reams and reams and reams of information and data and studies come in and say, we actually have no evidence for the idea of trickle-down economics. And then rather than the individual changing their mind or exposing that, hey, I was wrong, I had this idea and it was wrong, they tend to hold on and push the idea even in the contrast of evidence that opposes that idea, because they've now come to associate the idea with their identity and with their self-esteem. And so changing their mind about something is not as simple as changing your mind. It's about feeling like you've been you've lost face, or you've lost value, or you were wrong and therefore you're less than, or what have you. And so it creates this rigidity to incorporating new information or viewing the world in a dispassionate way. You might also see this in your common everyday life if you maybe, I don't know some sports fans, and college football season comes around, and they look at the odds that this team will win and this team will lose, and they completely disregard them, and they bet a lot of money on the team that is associated with where they went to school, right? They think where they went to school, because they have an association with it, has a higher probability of winning the Totitos Bowl or something. And that's not bearing out in probability and statistics. It's just being weighted because they have an association with the thing. Now, some of the areas in which these represent obviously in behavioral psychology. They're very well studied. They're very useful to know. You should get familiar with as many of them as possible, not only in yourself, but in others, right? Because it helps you to become a persuasive communicator, if not, well, a manipulative one, to tell you the truth. And it also helps you from being persuaded and being manipulated if you're familiar with the pitfalls of human thinking. And the information is out there, right? People know this stuff, and they use it quite regularly. So I would suggest that you know this stuff as well, and certainly go beyond this introductory lecture in learning it. But as we boil some of this stuff down and try to make it more economics, what we do is try to boil it down to kind of theories that we can contrast with existing theories in economics. And prospect theory is one of the ways that has happened. The idea is that in economics, you have rational individuals who are trying to maximize something called utility, and they're taking into account these measurable probabilities of things occurring or things not occurring. So all very scientific stuff, right? We're looking at probabilities and statistics, and then we're looking at trying to maximize something called utility. Prospect theory says that we don't think individuals act in this way of maximizing utility rationally using probabilities. We think people are much more loosey-goosey about this, that they're not actually trying to maximize utility. They're trying to maximize something more kind of abstract and tough to define, something like values, right? Which we're not really sure what that means, right? Utility is a more precise definition, right? And rather than maximizing utility, they're maximizing values, and rather than using probability as their mathematical tool to maximize utility, they're using more generalized weights to maximize something like values, right? So the idea behind prospect theory is that the manner in which agents in an economic model think is very different than what has been proposed in the orthodoxy, and is much more messy and much more prone to error. A quick note before we get into prospect theory and an example of it, I just want to bring up some other kind of behavioral cognitive biases. One of them that operates, not necessarily just at the individual level, which is what some of the cognitive biases that we looked at in the last slide were, but that can operate in large groups of individuals. So we talked about social contagion as generating widespread delusions, widespread mass manias, right, that tend to sort of catch fire and decouple people from, logic and reality. And groupthink is one of the favorite ones of those that typically happens in these groups of human groups, human organizations, human institutions. And the idea is that institutions, corporations, political bodies, teams, so on and so forth, they collectively can be prone to mass delusions and mass cognitive biases that lead to errors, and that these errors can be disastrous. So there are a lot of examples of groupthink. One of them is the Bay of Pigs invasion. Another one of them is Enron, and yet another one of them is frequently plane crashes, So let's read through what groupthink is. A group of well-intentioned people. These are not evil people. These are not people that want to do something terrible. They're not people that want to crash a plane. They're not people that want to, have a disaster invading Cuba or something. But they're very well-intentioned people. But they make irrational or suboptimal decisions because they are spurred by the urge to conform to the group. And they have this kind of underlying belief that if you dissent from the group, it's basically impossible, right? You'll be ostracized, you'll be canceled, you'll be eliminated, or what have you, right? So here individuals are valuing harmony and coherence of the group above any critical rational thought. So kind of a simple example might be you've got a plane, and you've got a pilot and a co-pilot, and there's established hierarchy there, right? And the pilot knows what they're doing, and the co-pilot is secondary to them. And the co-pilot sees something going wrong. The dials are going crazy. This looks really bad, but the co-pilot isn't batting an eye, and the the co-pilot doesn't want to say anything because they don't want to ruin the harmony of the situation, or the coherence of the situation, right? By challenging, the existing orthodoxy, if you will, or right, or whatever the orthodoxy of the group is. And so they don't mention anything. They don't mention anything, and then of course the plane crashes. There are lots of vivid examples in the literature about groupthink and problems that have occurred because of it. One of my favorite authors, Malcolm Gladwell, does a little bit here and there with groupthink, and it's definitely worth looking into, especially if you're thinking of forming an institution that's not going to make bad or disastrous ideas. You have to be able to avoid groupthink, which can be very hard to do because what it requires is cultivating dissent, right? Cultivating a challenge to your authority, cultivating a challenge to the mission, cultivating, right, reasonable, critical, rational thought, and placing harmony or coherence secondary to that to ensure that you don't lead to this sort of feedback loop of support that generates a, buffalo over the cliff kind of, happenstance. So groupthink, fascinating, right? We've also got risk and uncertainty, and this isn't necessarily behavioral or cognitive bias, but it is something that individuals generally confuse. They think that risk and uncertainty are the same thing, and so they face uncertainty and they deal with it like it was risk, or they face risk and they deal with it like it was uncertainty. In fact, these are two different concepts, and we have very firm sort of, clear definitions of what those different concepts are. The definition of risk and uncertainty, they're different, and the distinction is clear, right? Risk is present when future events occur with a measurable probability, right? We can analyze risk by looking at the probability associated with the roll of a dice. Uncertainty, on the other hand, is present when the likelihood of future events is indefinite or incalculable. We don't have enough information to be able to say there's a 50% chance of this, there's an 80% chance of this, there's a 20% chance of this. We're dealing then with uncertainty, if you will. There are different concepts and different mathematical and rational tools are required to handle them. Let's try to wrap this up real quick by giving you kind of a simple example of prospect theory. You might be able to see how kind of this irrationality kind of plays out between utility and probabilities and values and weights. So let's give you a couple different options. We're going to give you two different bets here. This is the first bet, and we're just going to ask you, hey, which one would you choose? So both of these bets are free. You just have to pick one. You pick either bet 1 or bet 2, and you can pick either one you want. Your first choice in this first set of bets is you can choose to have a 25% chance of winning $3,000, or you can choose to have a 20% chance of winning $4,000, right? So you got a higher probability of winning a smaller amount of money and a smaller probability of winning a larger amount of money, and all of that is quantified for you, right? You know the 25% chance of winning, which gives you a 75% chance of losing. And in bet 2, right, you have a 20% chance of winning, which gives you an 80% chance of losing. And you want to be able to choose the rational bet constrained to this idea. Remember, it's a free bet, right? So think about which one of these that you would pick, and think about the way that you're choosing between them. So as you decide between, bet 1 and bet 2, I want you to be aware and think about what mechanisms are going on in your brain, what methodology are you using, right, to choose either 1 or either 2. Are you guessing? Are you using a Ouija board? What is the methodology that you're using, and is that methodology rational, right? So you can pause this if you want to and think through that, meditate on that, really scrutinize your thought process. We've got another set of bets, and we're going to ask you about those as well. These ones might be easier for you. So here's another, set of free bets, and you can either choose 1 or 2. Now, number 1 is that you have a 100% chance of winning $3,000. Right, so 0% chance of losing. You're guaranteed to walk away with $3,000. Or you can have bet 2, which is an 80% chance of winning $4,000. That's a pretty good chance of winning $4,000, but you still have some probability of losing, and the probability of losing is 20%. So you may want to pause this. Again, choose either 1 or 2, right? Bet 1 or bet 2, and think about what's driving you, what the mechanism, what the gears are turning in your brain that's causing you to either choose one or the other. Are they rational? Are they not? Now, as we move on to the next slide, we're going to show you the way a rational individual would resolve these two bets. So for the set of bets 1, right, you had the 25% chance of winning $3,000 and a 75% chance of winning nothing. So your expected return on this is the average of these two as is weighted by the probabilities, which is $750. Now, you could have chosen otherwise bet 2, right? You had a smaller chance of winning a larger amount of money, a 20% chance of winning $4,000 and an 80% chance of walking away with nothing. And we looked at the expected return of that given the weights according to probabilities. Well, your expected payoff would have been 800. So the rational individual would have chosen to maximize utility by maximizing their probability of winning, X amount of money. So bet 2 would have been the choice there, right? And keep in mind the structure of this is the probability of the event occurring as a success plus the probability of the event occurring as a failure, right? And that's how we're calculating this expected payout. The expected payout in option number 2 is larger than that of number 1. A rational individual would take option number 2. Fantastic, right? Let's look at our second choice, right? You had a 100% probability of winning $3,000 and a 0% probability of walking away with nothing. You were guaranteed to walk away with $3,000. Or you could have chosen, right, bet number 2, which was an 80% chance of earning $4,000 and a 20% chance of walking away with nothing. Now, I would wager that most of you chose option number 1, the 100% chance of winning $3,000. Right? And in fact, if you look at, this is obviously something that's been done to, many, many people. It's something they've surveyed many, many times. And most of the time, people pick option number 1, even people that maybe have an economics degree, right? So the reality is that the rational individual would have looked at the expected payoffs according to probability weights and chosen option number 2, the 80% chance of winning $4,000. Remember, it's kind of the same logic as what's happening in your first set of choices, only in your second set of choices we've thrown an extreme monkey wrench in the game, which is the idea as it occurs to the human mind of something called certainty, which apparently individuals value far more than actual probability spreads, right? So rational individuals would have picked option number 2 in our second set of bets, but most individuals pick number 1 because of this kind of jarring in the head of the prospect of certainty. So in bet 2, most people choose option number 1. Likely because of the certainty. The error here is that the probability assignments that individuals are placing on their decision making are not continuous, right? But they're discrete. They're chunky, right? There's ideas that there is a low probability, a medium probability, and a high probability, and only 3 categories in the human mind for how they weight, right? Rather than use probabilities, but how they weight their pursuit of value. Whereas a rational individual would look at a whole spectrum of probabilities that were continuous, not small, medium, and almost certain, but 10%, 20%, 25%, 25.6%, 25.67%, all the way up to 100%, right? And the ratios between each of those increments of continuous probability would be comparable rather than something that's larger and chunkier, like a discrete weighting of probability. So most people don't use continuous probability when they're making decisions. They use discrete ones that overweight things such as certainty. So that's one of the classic sort of examples to try to reveal the idea that here's at least one of these mechanisms that kind of shows to individuals that, hey, people are not prone to acting rationally. They're much more prone to acting via cognitive bias because, of course, their evolutionary psychology has given them that as their mechanism for survival. But a mechanism for survival is not necessarily a mechanism to optimize or to thrive. And using reason and science gives us those mechanisms to optimize and thrive, not just haphazardly survive, right? And so there are several examples. There's many, many examples of these. This is just one to get your toes a little bit in the water with respect to cognitive biases and the way that they can be leveraged into things like behavioral economics and behavioral finance. It's a very, very rich, wonderful literature, and if you ever get into it, I think you'll find much value in it. And I hope you saw some value in this introduction to behavioral finance. Anyway, have a lovely day, and we'll see you in our next set of lectures. All right, be well.